In this episode, we're going to take privacy risk out of the foggy world of vague labels like high, medium, and low, and turn it into something you can discuss with numbers and clear assumptions. For the Certified Information Privacy Technologist, CIPT, exam, you do not need to become a mathematician, but you do need to understand why quantifying risk can improve decisions, reduce arguments, and make privacy work feel more connected to real business trade-offs. Beginners often think risk is either obvious or unknowable, and both extremes create problems because teams either panic or shrug. A structured quantification approach gives you a middle path where you can estimate risk in a consistent way, communicate uncertainty honestly, and prioritize the work that reduces harm the most. The framework we'll use here is Factor Analysis of Information Risk, FAIR, which provides a practical model for breaking risk into parts that can be estimated and compared. By the end, you should be able to describe how FAIR thinks about loss, how you would apply it to a privacy scenario, and how it helps you choose what to fix first. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful way to enter this topic is to remember that risk is not the same thing as a bad thing happening, because risk is about uncertainty and potential impact. When you say something is risky, you are saying there is a chance of loss and that the size of that loss matters, not that loss is guaranteed. In privacy, loss can include harm to individuals, financial costs, legal consequences, operational disruption, and damage to trust, and those losses can vary widely depending on the scenario. Many organizations struggle because they can describe risks in emotional language, but they can't compare them consistently, so the loudest voice wins instead of the best reasoning. Quantification is not about pretending you know the future perfectly. It is about forcing clarity on what you believe could happen and how often. That clarity is valuable even when your estimates are rough, because it reveals where you have strong evidence versus where you are guessing. For exam scenarios, understanding this mindset helps you choose answers that emphasize structured assessment and prioritization rather than vague statements. FAIR is helpful because it provides a model for thinking about risk in terms of loss event frequency and loss magnitude, which are concepts that beginners can grasp without needing advanced math. Loss event frequency is about how often you expect a certain type of loss to occur, given the environment and the threat landscape. Loss magnitude is about how big the loss would be if the event occurs, which includes multiple categories of impact that can be estimated in dollars, time, or other comparable units. In privacy, you might not always convert everything into dollars in a classroom sense, but the logic still applies, because you can still estimate relative size based on real consequences. FAIR encourages you to break frequency and magnitude into smaller factors, so you can estimate each one using evidence and reason rather than gut feeling. That makes it easier to explain your conclusions and to revise them when new information arrives. The framework becomes a shared language that reduces confusion in cross-functional conversations. To apply FAIR, it helps to start with a clear definition of what the loss event is, because vague events produce vague numbers. A loss event should describe a specific type of privacy harm, such as unauthorized disclosure of a customer database, inappropriate internal access to sensitive user attributes, or vendor misuse of data beyond an agreed purpose. The more precisely you describe the event, the easier it becomes to estimate frequency and magnitude, because you can ask focused questions about exposure, controls, and likely impacts. Beginners often define events too broadly, like privacy breach, which hides important differences between, for example, a small accidental disclosure and a large systemic exposure. FAIR thinking pushes you to define the scenario in a way that matches real decision-making, because decisions are made about specific risks, not about abstract fear. This is also where contextual integrity reasoning can help, because it clarifies what kind of misuse would violate expectations and cause harm. Once you have a clear event statement, the rest of the analysis becomes more disciplined. When estimating loss event frequency in a privacy scenario, you are essentially asking how likely it is that the loss event will occur within a given time period. That estimate depends on the presence of threats, the degree of exposure, and the strength of controls, even if you are not doing a deep technical assessment. For example, if a system is internet-facing, handles sensitive personal data, and has weak access controls, the likelihood of unauthorized access may be higher than in a tightly segmented internal system. If a vendor has broad access to data, uses subprocessors, and lacks strong oversight, the likelihood of misuse or mishandling can be higher than when scope is narrow and monitoring is strong. In fair terms, you are reasoning about how often threats act and how often those actions succeed, which is a practical way to think without relying on vague labels. Beginners sometimes think likelihood is a feeling, but it can be grounded in observable factors like attack surface, history of incidents, and control maturity. For the exam, showing that you understand the drivers of frequency helps you select answers that reduce likelihood through appropriate controls and governance. Loss magnitude and privacy risk is often where people get stuck because privacy harm can feel hard to measure. FAIR helps by encouraging you to consider multiple components of loss, such as direct response costs, legal and regulatory consequences, operational disruption, and trust-related impacts that can translate into customer churn or reputational damage. In privacy incidents, costs might include investigation time, notification efforts, customer support surge, and remediation engineering work. In misuse scenarios that never make headlines, loss might still include internal time spent correcting data handling, reworking features, or responding to complaints, which is real cost even if there is no fine. For harm to individuals, quantification can be challenging, but you can still treat it as a meaningful part of magnitude by considering the sensitivity of data and the plausible harms like fraud, harassment, or discrimination. The key is not to claim precision you don't have, but to structure the estimate so decision-makers can see what is driving it. On the exam, you may be asked to prioritize risks, and understanding magnitude drivers helps you justify why some risks deserve attention first. A beginner-friendly way to start quantifying is to use ranges rather than single-point numbers, because ranges reflect uncertainty honestly. Instead of saying the likelihood is exactly 10%, you might estimate a plausible range based on evidence, like low to moderate likelihood, and then translate that into a range of events per year if you are doing a more formal approach. Instead of saying the impact is exactly $1 million, you might estimate a range based on comparable incidents, response costs, and the scale of affected data. The real value is that ranges let you compare risks even when you're not perfectly sure, because you can see which risks have consistently higher expected impact across plausible assumptions. FAIR also supports the idea of sensitivity, meaning you can test how your result changes if one assumption shifts, which reveals what information would most improve your analysis. Beginners often avoid numbers because they fear being wrong, but structured ranges reduce that fear because they frame estimates as reasoned judgments, not as guarantees. This mindset is useful on the exam because it aligns with mature risk management rather than wishful certainty. To make this concrete, imagine a scenario where a mobile app collects precise location to provide a nearby services feature, and the data is also sent to a third party for analytics. A clear loss event might be unauthorized disclosure of precise location data due to misconfiguration or vendor mishandling. For frequency, you would consider exposure points, such as how data is transmitted, whether access is scoped, whether the vendor has strong controls, and whether monitoring exists to detect anomalies. For magnitude, you would consider that precise location can be highly sensitive because it can reveal habits, home addresses, and patterns that create real safety risks, which increases potential harm to individuals. You would also consider regulatory consequences, especially if the organization's notice and consent posture does not align with the sharing and operational costs tied to incident response. Even without exact numbers, you can see how this risk might outrank a lower sensitivity event, like a brief exposure of non-sensitive preference settings. The point is that FAIR gives you a disciplined way to explain why you prioritize one over the other, rather than relying on intuition. FAIR also helps you identify the most effective mitigation by clarifying whether the risk is driven more by frequency or magnitude, because the best control depends on what drives the risk. If a risk is frequent but low magnitude, you might prioritize controls that reduce the number of occurrences through better process discipline, like change reviews that prevent recurring misconfigurations. If a risk is rare but extremely high magnitude, you might prioritize controls that reduce impact, like minimizing the stored dataset, shortening retention, or delinking identifiers so that exposure is less harmful. In privacy, reducing magnitude often aligns with minimization and lifecycle controls, because less data and shorter retention reduce the harm of exposure. Reducing frequency often aligns with access controls, monitoring, and operational reviews that prevent or detect misuse quickly. Beginners sometimes pick controls based on what sounds strongest, like encryption, but FAIR pushes you to choose controls that address the real driver of risk. This is exam-friendly reasoning because it shows you can match mitigations to the scenario rather than applying a one-size-fits-all solution. Another important part of prioritization is comparing risks across different domains, like internal misuse risk versus external attack risk, because privacy programs often have limited time and must choose where to invest. External threats can be dramatic, but internal misuse, overbroad access, and vendor drift can create steady harm that is easier to overlook. FAIR encourages you to treat both as comparable loss events by estimating frequency and magnitude for each. An internal misuse event might be more frequent if many employees have access and monitoring is weak, even if each event affects fewer records. An external breach might be less frequent if controls are strong, but higher magnitude if it affects a large dataset. By comparing the expected loss of each, you can justify prioritization decisions in a way that is defensible to both privacy and engineering stakeholders. Beginners often prioritize based on fear of headlines, but a mature program prioritizes based on expected harm and cost. On the exam, this kind of reasoning can help you choose the best next step when multiple risks are competing. FAIR also supports clearer communication, which is a major benefit in privacy technology because privacy decisions often involve people who speak different professional languages. Engineers might focus on technical feasibility, legal might focus on obligations, product might focus on user experience, and leadership might focus on risk and cost. Quantification provides a bridge because it translates concerns into comparable terms, like expected loss reduction, which helps teams agree on priorities even when they disagree on philosophy. It also helps avoid the trap of treating every privacy concern as equally urgent, which can lead to fatigue and bypass. When you present a structured estimate, you are not demanding action based on authority. You are inviting a decision based on shared reasoning. This is especially important when you need resources, because resource requests are more persuasive when they are tied to measurable risk reduction. For the exam, showing awareness that risk models support communication and prioritization can help you select answers that reflect mature program behavior. A common beginner misunderstanding is to think that quantification requires perfect data, and if you don't have perfect data, you should not attempt it at all. In reality, privacy programs often start with limited data, and quantification improves over time as you collect incident history, control performance metrics, and clearer inventories of processing. The right approach is to begin with what you know, document assumptions, and update as evidence improves. Another misunderstanding is to treat the first number produced as truth, which is dangerous because it can create false confidence. FAIR is meant to support learning, not to freeze reality. So the best practice is to treat estimates as living models that should be revised when systems change or when new incidents reveal new information. This ties directly into privacy operations, because operational feedback loops provide the data that improves risk estimates. On the exam, answers that include documenting assumptions and improving measurement over time often reflect this mature understanding. Quantifying privacy risk also benefits from strong scoping discipline, because a poorly scoped event can inflate numbers and lead to the wrong priorities. If you assume a scenario affects all users when it actually affects only a small segment, magnitude may be overstated. If you assume data is highly sensitive without verifying what fields are involved, you may misclassify harm. If you ignore downstream copies and logs in analytics, you may understate scope and miss real exposure, which leads to underestimation. Good quantification begins with accurate data flow knowledge and clear definitions of the event, which is why inventory and mapping are foundational. It also depends on understanding control effectiveness, because controls determine how often threats succeed and how much data is exposed. Beginners sometimes think of risk as independent of controls, but in reality, controls are what shape both frequency and magnitude. This is why FAIR is not separate from engineering. It relies on understanding how systems are built and operated. To apply FAIR quickly in an exam-style scenario, you can follow a short mental sequence that keeps you structured without becoming mechanical. First, define the loss event in plain language, making sure it includes what data is involved and what harmful outcome occurs. Next, think about frequency drivers, such as exposure, threat presence, and control weaknesses that make the event more likely. Then, think about magnitude drivers, such as number of affected individuals, sensitivity of data, response costs, and potential legal or trust consequences. After that, consider which driver is dominant and choose mitigations that reduce that driver most directly, either by reducing exposure and success likelihood or by reducing dataset sensitivity and retention. Finally, use the comparison logic to prioritize, asking which risk reduction yields the biggest drop in expected loss for the effort. This method helps you avoid random guessing when multiple answer choices look plausible. It also aligns with the deeper goal of FAIR, which is not numbers for their own sake, but better decisions. When you learn to use FAIR to quantify and prioritize privacy risk, you gain a practical superpower, the ability to turn privacy conversations into structured decision-making rather than debates driven by fear, convenience, or vague labels. For the Certified Information Privacy Technologist, CIPT, exam, that matters because many questions are essentially asking you to choose the most effective action under constraints, and quantification thinking improves how you evaluate trade-offs. If you can define the loss event, reason about frequency and magnitude drivers, and pick controls that reduce the biggest drivers, you will choose answers that reflect mature privacy engineering practice. You will also be better prepared to explain why one risk outranks another, which is a common challenge for beginners who feel everything is important at once. The goal is not perfect prediction, but consistent prioritization that reduces real harm and supports user trust. With that mindset, FAIR becomes less like a specialized framework and more like a clear way to think when privacy risk needs to be managed responsibly.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.